All right, all right. We've reached that time of the day. This will be the final part, the closing chapter of your Women with Drive Summit 5, driven by Mobil 1 as we close down yet another impactful moment together here in these four walls. I'm so excited to hear what will come after these 2 days and the feedback that we get from everyone. So it's always bittersweet at this time when you know that it's almost over, but I think you guys will enjoy our closing speaker here today. It is an honor to invite yet again to the stage Miss Lyn St. James.
I get introduced, which I totally am honored and appreciated, when they list all those Hall of Fames and everything. But so I'm going to take a little bit of a risk here and talk to you a little bit about the past. Because when I did what I did, most of you were not even alive yet. And it was a different world then, and I tend to be I'm always looking forward. I don't look back myself. I'm always looking forward, what's next, and you are the future, so, that's how I get excited, is because, I'm looking forward and you are the future. But somehow I think, and people have asked me a lot of times when I was racing, people, what's it like to be a woman in a male-dominated field? And, that was always a hard one to answer because, first of all, I almost didn't want to talk about it and make a big deal about it, and then, you're not going to give it a really good answer or the right answer, so you're trying to figure out what is the right answer. So, but in reality, all of us, and I made a comment earlier about Kaylin Jackson's comment, about learning about yourself is how to be a good leader, and I'm hoping that all of this that you've experienced, and I just want you to all know that in my mind, you are all leaders, and I hope that the information that you've gathered here and throughout your entire career, that you'll feel that way and not always look that there's somebody else leading and you're following. But the other part of it is that we are a product of our experiences, and so I started to think about my experiences, because our experiences end up shaping who we are. It becomes our new norm. And your norm, in most cases now, because of the experience probably of the last 5-6 years of women in motorsports, whether you're a driver, engineer, leader, executive, it's been pretty good. I mean, it's a pretty good environment, that culture. And it's not that mine was so bad, but it has shaped me. And so when I look back at the 70s and the 80s and the 90s when I raced, I started to think about that, of what I was going to say to you today, and I started to remember, I started looking back, which I don't tend to do very often, and realized that, in most cases, even in my SCCA days, my very first race car was a Ford Pinto, which was my street car that I drove back and forth to work during the week and raced it on weekends as a member of SCCA in the Florida region. And from that point on, those 70s and 80s, for sure, those 2 decades, I was often the only female race car driver. But also when I thought about the culture, that in most cases, it's not that I was the only woman, because God knows I definitely was not the only woman at the track, but most of the other women there were just wives, girlfriends, corner workers, volunteers, staff. And so there weren't very many of us, and we didn't hang out together. I mean, I used to go to the beer party on Saturday night. In fact, my very first race in that Pinto, I lost control of the car. When I was a rookie, they had a big X on the side of the car, and I lost control of the car, and it ended up down at Palm Beach International Raceway. It ended up in a lake, which I thought was a pond that would be no big deal, but the car completely submerged. And so I watched the car go blub, blub, blub. The car disappeared. I'm standing there as the only evidence, wishing that it hadn't happened. And that was early in the day. We waited all day while the car stayed in that water. And at the end of the day, the end of the evening, it was to go down and watch the divers pull the car out. And I remember standing on a little hill there, not even a hill, just a little elevated area. There are no hills in South Florida. I remember I had, shorts and T-shirts on, just like everybody else, drinking a beer. And the guy next to me said, "So who was driving that car?" And I said, "I don't know." We didn't put our names on the car back then. I just had a number on the side. So, that the beer parties or the social events that we had, that was everybody. There was nothing that was just for women. And I do remember, fast forward, and it was in the 80s, it was actually in the early 90s when I got involved with the Women's Sports Foundation. I'm going to tell you that in a minute, but I'm going to fast forward. Vicki O'Connor was the head of the Formula Atlantic Series. She was a female executive, I'm going to call leader in racing. And there were a few others. And I invited them to come to the Women's Sports Foundation banquet in New York. And then we had this great event that the Women's Sports Foundation does, and all these women athletes. And I'd been involved enough as the past president of the organization. And I got these women, and Judy Stropus, who was really very important in media, and some other women. And I'm going around the room. I said, Vicki, you should become the president of SCCA. Judy, you should become, the head of a marketing and communications company instead of just being a timer and scorer and do press releases for race teams. And I went around the room, and they're all looking at me like, you're crazy. We don't want to do that. I was so disappointed that they really didn't want to step up and actually go anymore. But at one point, we were at the racetrack, and we decided to get together and start talking about it. Now, we're talking about 6 of us. 6 of us are sitting in a tent at Road America, having a beer at the end of the evening, and all of a sudden, we started to notice the parade of guys that would walk by us. Oh, my God, they're together. They're talking together. What are they talking about? It was weird. So we didn't ever really get together and talk much. We just didn't. We were just part of the culture, part of racing. So that was my experience for the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. We just didn't separate ourselves and get together. And that's why something like this is so phenomenal. And it's just because you are all getting together, and you will continue to get together. You will continue to have events that you meet and all of that kind of stuff. So I realize that this is your new norm. It's not my norm. I'm still blown away by it because it is something that is still, it's just foreign to me and new. So fast forward, John Doonan mentioned that. I did spend most of the decade of the 1980s racing in the SCCA Trans Am Series. For Ford, I became a Ford factory driver in 1981 because I wrote them letters for 3 years and said they needed me. They had to have me. Ford I saw an article in Car and Driver magazine, and on the sidebar there was an article that said, it was titled Ford and Feminism. And it talked about Ford Motor Company wanting to have employment opportunities for women in non-traditional areas. It didn't say anything about racing. It was just about hiring women in non-traditional areas in the industry. And it quoted 2 people, and I wrote letters to them for 3 years. And would send them articles anytime I raced or whatever. So finally, because they didn't have a Ford racing department at the time, this was in the late 70s, in 1980, I got an opportunity to go to Dearborn to present who I was and what I'd done and what I wanted to do and what I could do for Ford. And in 1981, I got them as a sponsor for 1 year. That was a tipping point. We all need a tipping point in our careers, regardless of what it is, that validates who you are, that validates you in a way, but also validates who you are to others. So as a factory driver for Ford Motor Company, that was a big deal. And I'm convinced they said, we got to hire her because she's driving us crazy. She will not leave. So persistence pays off. So for most of the 80s then, I was a factory driver for Ford. I got to also race in the IMSA Camel GT Series. I got to race a Ford Probe, which was the prototype, which was a dream of mine to be. I always had a strategy of what I could do for Ford, but what race car I wanted to be in next and what race team. So it was a decade of unbelievable opportunities and experiences and challenges. And again, this was as an individual. I had friends, I had allies, men and women, it didn't matter. So it was just figure it out, Lyn. Just figure it out and make it happen. And so, the opportunity came. I set records at Talladega in 1988 in a Ford Thunderbird because I saw that there was a brochure that was at Talladega, and it talked about, because that is one of the fastest tracks. It is the fastest oval track in the United States, so that's where usually speed records are done. And I think it was either A.J. Foyt had set the record at like 276 miles an hour or something in an average speed. But they also posted in this brochure that the fastest female was Janet Guthrie at 186 miles an hour. And I'm like, it makes us look like we can't go fast. Why did they even put that in there, And so I said, well, we got to fix that. So I convinced Ford to take a Thunderbird and convinced the Elliots to build the car, Bill Elliott and his team. And we went to Talladega in 1988, and I was also seeing Ford was getting into stock car racing more in NASCAR. And I thought, well, I've raced these Mustangs and the Ford Pro, big cars, had some victories, still a factory driver for Ford, so I think maybe I should go stock car driving. So I went to Humpy Wheeler, who those of you who've been around a while know who he was, Mr. Charlotte Motor Speedway, and I don't know, he was just a fantastic promoter. And I walked into his office. He threw a set of keys at me as I walked into the door. Fortunately, I caught them. So that was my first test. What was the reaction time? Sat down, talked to him about wanting to be a stock car driver. Lyn, let me tell you, you're one of those sporty car drivers. And he said, you need to go into like this sonic sound room and clean your brain of everything you know about driving a race car and start all over again. And he went on, and I walked out of there going, I don't think that's going to work, And then I got the opportunity to drive that stock car at Talladega, and it definitely did not feel right. I mean, I was not having fun. We set the records at 212.577. By the way, that car, that Thunderbird, is on display in the lobby of the PRI offices in Speedway. So it is a car that's still around. It's a really cool car to look at. It only ran at Talladega, and then I got to take it up the hill at Goodwood. But in driving that, I was not happy. Me and that car were not getting along. At one time, Bill put his head in and he said, how's it going? And I said, I have no idea who's driving it because it's not me. I mean, I turn the wheel, nothing happens. And I mean, it was just really, really, really awkward. 3 weeks later, I got to drive an Indy car for the first time. Dick Simon, I had met, had talked to him, I want to drive an Indy car. I want to drive an Indy car. And you drivers out there know what it's like. I want to drive this. I want to drive that. I want to drive an Indy car. I just wanted to drive one because I knew it was the ultimate race car in this country that I could possibly just have a chance, He let me, 3 weeks later after that Talladega run in the Thunderbird, I got to drive an Indy car for the first time at Memphis Raceway. I didn't even know there was a track in Memphis, but there is. And I spent the day, because of Dick giving me that opportunity, I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. I mean, that car and I just hit it off, and it was wonderful. And at the end of that test, Dick Simon looked at me and said, we can do this. He didn't say, you can do this. He said, we can do this. And that's when I knew I had a team owner who was going to be behind me and try to make this happen. 3 years later, after 150 companies said no, trying to get sponsorship, the 151st company that said yes was J.C. Penney. And in 1992, I got to the Indy 500. Now, I knew Janet Guthrie had raced in Indy 3 times, was the first woman, but it was like in the 70s, and now I'm 1992, so there's a plenty of gap in between. But there were still folks around that were around when Janet was around, whether it was quarter workers or officials or other drivers. So there were eyes on me, I knew, but I didn't care. I just knew I had to stay focused, and to be honest, it was like Christmas every day. That's just how I felt. I was at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, driving an Indy car. It was literally go to the track every day, whether I was going on track or not. But at one point, I had to go to the bathroom. And I was out on the pit wall, and they had it's different than the way it is now. And I said, it was like right at the beginning of my rookie orientation. Dick said, oh, there's one, you go down there, and right where there's the media room, there's a door on the opposite that. Just go in there. There'll be some, workers in there, but there's a restroom in there. So I follow the directions. I go in, and these guys are sitting in there playing cards. And I walk into my race suit, and they're like, what are you doing here? And I said, I just have to go to the bathroom. And I went to the bathroom and left. By the time I got back to the pits, to the pits where Dick was, what did you do? I said, I don't know. I just went where you told me to go. Well, I didn't know that there were a lot of evidently scuttlebutts that Janet had in the 70s, because there was no place for that. At that point, there were no ladies' rooms, I don't think, except for the fans. And so she had to change where the fans were. So, sometimes you walk into things that you have no idea what you're walking into. My advice, just ignore it and move on. I mean, don't react. That's why when people say about, what's it like being a woman in a male job? What do the guys think of you? I said, don't ask me, ask them. So, but in 72, I just wanted to point out, we did have a crew member who came from the National Guard, a female crew member. That was, I don't know how that happened, but the team put that together. And the other thing in the 90s that I did that had more of a female part of my story was I had, you don't even want to know this, but it's true. The Indianapolis 500 was my second open wheel race in my life and the very first oval track race in my life. I do not recommend it, but it's the only option I had. So I'm now driving during rookie orientation down the back straightaway at probably 215, 212 miles an hour back then, and my helmet kept coming off because I'd never been at that high speed in an open wheel car. And I'd come in the pits, and I tell them, I can't see because the helmet's lifting off my head because of the aerodynamics. So there was this woman who I met for the first time. Her name is Lyn St, who is one of my dearest friends today. At that time, she was working for Bill Simpson from Simpson Race Products. She literally parked herself in my pit and then kept changing the internal of my helmet. I mean, we worked for hours until I could finally get my helmet to fit right. She had to put foam in, and and I'd go out and do a lap or a half a lap and come back in until we got it right. So here's a woman who just worked in the industry, who did what her job was. I mean, it wasn't like I don't think she did anything special, but she did something special for me, but not because I was a woman. And to this day, we are still bonded, and so that's a very special to me woman-to-woman story. The other is in the 90s, after successfully racing at Indy, I got so much fan mail. And that fan mail was not just wanting an autograph. They wanted advice. And I didn't feel right just sending an autograph back. So between that and then the Billie Jean King influence of telling me, this is not about you, that you are the most powerful while you're racing and competing, it's about the next generation, is when I then created a driver development program. And in 20 years, I took over 230 women drivers once a year to this driver development program. Well, the very first year, the very beginning of that, I met a woman who was a racer, who I didn't know existed. And I also worked with a company called Human Performance International that created a program, not talked about it, they actually tested the physical and mental capacity of race car drivers to help them be better and to figure out whether they actually were going to be able to be better, because sometimes we just have issues that we can't fix. But in most cases, we can fix them if you're willing to do the work. And so it was called Human Performance International, and I met with I was part of the foundation of that company. And they told me, they said, there's this gal. She just went through our program and did all the testing. And she's like right at the top of all of the results. She's equal to Jeff Gordon, Al Unser Jr. I mean, these were some world-class drivers that had gone through the program. I'm like, I got to meet her. Well, her name is Renee Dupree. Did you all meet Renee Dupree when you registered, right? Renee was an unbelievable modified race car racer from up in the Northeast. So that's how I met Renee. And we had an intense conversation in the very beginning when we first met, because I thought, there is the next generation. There's the one that I've got to be able to work with and take all the way to the top. She's going to get in one of those stock cars and be a stock car driver. But Renee is also a human being that has her own brain, her own desires, her own experiences, right? I mean, I couldn't dictate that. But the bond that we have, even to this day, she came to my driver development program. She's on the board of the foundation. She's on the board of WIMNA. I mean, she is part of the inner circle. So our experiences, the people we meet, the decisions we make about those people, the ones we bring into our life that help shape us. There's going to be different eras. I'm a different era than you guys. But I am so blessed to be able to see that there is a next generation, that women can be comfortable getting together, talking, no, there's no threat, and that the men are part of it. So this is the formation of what I didn't have, and I didn't miss it because I didn't know it existed, but I now get to see it and believe it myself, that this is the future of motorsports, because you are the future of motorsports. So don't stop. There were times, believe me, many times, when I was so pissed off and I was just the hell with them. But if your passion and your desire and your reward that you know that you can get if you hang in there, you'll come back. You may not come back even in the same business or the same office or the same, the same place, but if the passion is strong enough, and know that you've got a community to now support you. So go home, be blessed, and never lose the passion. Thank you.